Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today.
Of course, thank you so much. I'm excited to learn more about It Lives Inside and your process kind of creating it and directing it.
Amazing. Let's do it.
Yeah, so kind of jumping right in, how did you come up with this concept of a horror story around this Hindu mythological concept, basically?
Yeah, I was very much inspired by the kinds of ghost stories that I heard growing up that my grandfather told, and those they were kind of passed down through the generations. And I felt like there was something so universal about them, and I felt like they were passed down the generations for a reason because there was something really affecting about them. So I wanted to make a horror film that really accessed that kind of spookiness that I remember feeling from those. And then at the same time, I remember as a teenager, especially, just having kind of feeling caught between two worlds and having to kind of synthesize an Indian American identity based on that. And I felt like that was a really great conflict for a movie, for especially the main character of a horror film. So is that those two kind of impulses that came together and became It Lives Inside eventually?
Yeah, and so that kind of leads me directly into my next question, which was why you based it around high schoolers, because we don't see too many horror movies around high schoolers that are films. You see them more as TV shows. So I was wondering kind of why you decided to base it around that, but that's really interesting.
I mean, I love high school horror films when, to your point, when they are made and when they're good, they're just so iconic. I was thinking a lot about Christine and I was thinking about Carrie. Those are two of my favorite movies, both Stephen King adaptations. But, you know, I think it comes back to that idea of identity. I think in high school, identity feels least formed. And I think for me, certainly when I got to college, I was like, oh, everything that is quote unquote different about me is what's great about me. And I can exist in multiple worlds at once. But there's this sort of homogeneity in high school. And I felt like it wasn't just about culture. I felt like everybody could relate to this movie because there's something that everybody has that makes them feel different and outside of the norm. And so it felt like the conflict would be at its strongest if we made it a high school story.
Yeah, and so what format of the film was special effects and VFX and what, was kind of realistically filmed within that? Because having watched it, it's insane to see kind of the special effects that have happened throughout the film. So how did that process work?
I mean, I really believe in starting from a practical base. And even if we're using CGI and VFX, that we're always sort of building on something that was filmed, right? And I think in this film, we really tried to keep the monster very much in the audience's imagination for most of the movie, right? And so it was like there's a moment where there's eyes staring out of the closet, for example. We tried to show you just enough of a face for you to understand that there is a face, but not enough that you could place it. So there was this very much a calibration of the practical effects to keep it in the shadows. Later on, there's a moment where you see the creatures through a shower curtain, right? And so we tested so many different versions of shower curtain density to make sure that you were seeing just enough of the practical effects so that we could tease them throughout. And at the end of the film, we had a full sort of monster suit that our wonderful actress Janaea was wearing and sort of performing in, and there was an animatronic component to it. But then we augmented that with CGI. We augmented the eyes with CGI. There are faces on its body that are writhing around. We augmented those. So we really tried to use CGI as a tool to, build on top of the photographic material we already had practically.
Yeah, and kind of speaking of filming techniques, I noticed throughout the film there are these very long close-up shots of the actors and to kind of
Yeah.
depict their emotions. How was that filmed, and was that really thought, from the beginning, or did that just kind of happen spontaneously on set?
Well, it came from a really weird point of the place, which was we were testing lenses. And testing lenses is a great part of the process for me, especially with actors, because you want to think about what's the right lens for each actor, what's the right lens for the entire sort of emotional palette of the movie, and you try to create a language out of the lenses. And on this, we had the Cook anamorphics on this movie, and we found a 65 millimeter macro lens. And so because it's anamorphic, it has the field of view of a 32 millimeter, which is very close to how the human eye sees, but it feels very intimate. It feels very much like you're in the space of the actor, and you can get the camera really close because it's a macro lens. And when we were testing that, I felt like the close-ups we were getting of Megan, especially, it felt like those close-ups were so both intimate and kind of imposing, right? And that from that point on became such an important part of the visual language of the movie, because I think for me, there's nothing more cinematic I can put on screen than a great actor. And I had great actors on this movie. And especially with Megan, I wanted the camera to be so inside her space at all times, just as the kind of pressure that she feels that grows because of the creature is putting this kind of claustrophobia within her life.
Yeah, and it was really interesting also kind of watching it as a South Asian audience. I was kind of wondering from your lens how you adapted it for a Western audience, but also South Asian audience, because there's several times where her family speaks Hindi and, she is also speaking back. So how did that work? What was kind of running through your mind?
Well, I think the approach I wanted to take on the cultural sort of depiction was, first of all, I didn't want to, I guess, intellectualize or be didactic about it. I certainly can't speak on behalf of the entire South Asian community because it's such a diverse community and there's so many different experiences. But what I felt like I could do was kind of drop the audience into a dynamic and a household, a family that I understood, that felt like my family or the family of my friends, or so I wanted to really use behavior as the kind of thing that immerses the audience. A huge part of that was the language. I grew up fluently speaking our language, and we speak Assamese, which our family's from a place called Assam, but I knew so many of my friends that their parents would speak their language and they would speak English back. And I thought that was such an interesting kind of dynamic. So I said, well, this is how it needs to be. We need to be realistic about it. We just need to drop the audience into the everyday of these characters and let them learn through behavior rather than qualifying or saying, well, this is how this works and this is how this works. I think an audience enjoys, especially, and I'm saying in this case, a Western audience who isn't maybe, informed about how things work for us, I think they're going to enjoy just being kind of dropped in and not being talked down to, and just feeling like they too can just understand what's happening based on the characters and the behaviors they're seeing.
Yeah, and definitely I think, watching the film, that's very apparent. It
Mhm.
feels, worthy of both audiences and something that both audiences can relate to.
Yeah.
And it looks like an amazing film. So thank you so much for speaking with me today. And I really hope that the film does incredibly well.
Amazing. Thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.